just missed each other. I think it was a couple of months ago. You was doing a piece around
So good evening.
race up in Boston.
Good evening.
For me to be
Thank you.
the distance.
So by now you know who I am. I'm still going to repeat my name. I am Rob Robinson, one of the board members of this very conference. This is the final evening of the conference, and it's been a very successful one, as it has been in the past. First, we'd like to graciously thank John Jay for the space, but we'd like to graciously thank all of you for coming, because you make the conference. Give yourselves a hand. Go ahead. Don't be shy. I talked last night as I introduced the panel of a number of accomplishments, and I think the one that I'm proudest of as a board member is when I joined the board, there was no child care here. We are now in the 4th year in a row with child care, so as we move forward, we will continue to have child care at this conference. Thank you. As usual, I'm going to make an appeal that you donate to Left Forum. We have a staff of 2.5 people. We rely on the conference fees and the kind donations of the people that believe in this conference to keep this going every year, along with a core group of volunteers. But we like to make sure those volunteers are fed, that we're able to give them, at the very least, a transportation stipend, and in some cases, a stipend for extra work. But that comes from the kindness of you people, so I would ask that you visit our website and donate as often as you can at www.leftforum.org. Finally, we will have an evaluation of this conference posted on the website by Wednesday, June 6th. This conference comes from your thoughts and your praises, so we would ask that you kindly take a minute or two to fill out that evaluation come Wednesday. You will receive an email if you registered for this conference that gives you a link directly to that evaluation. And please take a minute to tell us what you like, what you didn't like, and what you want to see in the future. So without further ado, we talked about the 3 plenaries sort of interconnecting. On Friday night, we had Jane Sanders, Jumaane Williams, a New York City Council member. We had Gail McLaughlin, former mayor of Richmond, California, talking about how we got to this place in the age of Trump and fascism and authoritarian rule. How did we get here? And they talked about that on Friday. Last night, we had Sylvia Federici, Juan Gonzalez, Paul Jay, and others talk about the strategies and tactics that we used that were in some cases successful and in many cases not successful. Well, tonight, we're blessed with a group of visionaries on this panel, and I'm going to be proud to say handpicked by yours truly, because as a community organizer, I'm a believer in having a vision. Right? I often criticize, and I said this last night at this very microphone, that our left often is guilty of not having a vision. We can often tell you what's wrong. We'll paint through all these walls with what's wrong. But what is it we want to see, and how do we get there, is what we're not good at articulating. But I think the people that you're going to hear from tonight are good at that. So I'm looking forward to this particular plenary. I'm going to introduce the moderator for this panel. And before I do that, I'll preface this by saying one of the hats I wear, of the many that I wear, is a member of a small community-based funder in New York called North Star Fund. And that's when I first heard about the Brooklyn Movement Center, because a lot of the things people were saying was there wasn't good organizing going on in central Brooklyn. Wrong. I can tell you there's some damn good organizing going on in Brooklyn, and it's led by tonight's moderator. So I'm just going to quickly read a bio. Mark Winston-Griffith is a nationally recognized thought leader, community organizer, and journalist. A native of Crown Heights, Brooklyn, Mark Winston-Griffith is the co-founder and executive director of Brooklyn Movement Center, a membership-based community group, organizing group serving the neighborhoods of Bedford-Stuyvesant and North Crown Heights. He is also an adjunct faculty member of the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, hence the role of moderator, where he teaches a course in urban social issues. In the past, Mark has been the executive director at the Drum Major Institute for Public Policy, which was a policy think tank. He's been a field organizer with Move New York campaign and the director of the Neighborhood Economic Development Advocacy Project. And it's a very prominent financial services reform organization. So without further ado, good friend, great organizer, Mark Winston-Griffith.
Thank you. Good evening and peace, everyone. Good evening. Come on, y'all. Gotta do better than that. I need some energy. I've been viciously attacked by this virus called the common cold. And so I'm losing my voice, feeling under the weather, so I need some love from y'all out there. So peace, y'all. Good evening. Good evening. That's what's up. Okay. So thank you, Rob, for bringing us into this formation here today. I'm going to try to be true to the direction I was given by Rob. As he mentioned, the idea behind this panel is to look forward. We've heard a lot over the last couple of days, doing analysis, studying the problems. Now we're going to try to sketch out what the president in the future could and should look like. I think it's also important to recognize, and it's a little bit obvious, that if we're going to talk about the future of the left, that it has to be done so centering people of color. And so we were very conscientious about making sure that that was the case here. So this is going to be a very straightforward structure here this evening. I'm going to just first of all introduce you to everyone, just read their bios, and then systematically we're going to go across, and folks are going to give what is, I suspect, a 10-minute presentation on who they are, what they do, and to try to speak to what Rob said before about a vision, a social justice vision for the left, for this country, for this world, for our community. So, and I invite everyone to, you can chill down here with us, or you can stand up and speak at the podium. It's up to you, whatever does it for you. Okay, so let me start to my immediate left. Ajamu. Let me just get my stuff going on here. Ajamu Baraka is a veteran of the U.S. Black Liberation Movement, which is a Southern-based, internationally recognized Pan-African human rights and is an internationally recognized Pan-African human rights activist, organizer, and geopolitical analyst. Baraka was the 2016 candidate for vice president on the Green Party ticket with Jill Stein, and is currently the national organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace, an anti-war, repression, and anti-imperialist radical human rights formation. Baraka is editor and contributing columnist for Black Agenda Report, as well as contributing columnist to Counterpunch, Pambazaka, Dissident Voice, and a number of other alternative media outlets. Ajamu's latest publication is a contribution to Jackson Rising, the struggle for economic democracy and self-determination in Jackson, Mississippi. So everyone give Ajamu a warm welcome. I'm gonna go across though. I'm gonna keep going. And there we have my friend Cathy Dang. Cathy is organized in labor and community-led planning with the Restaurant Opportunities United, the Retail Action Project, and other grassroots organizations, including the fight to keep Walmart out of Los Angeles Chinatown. In her time with the Retail Action Project, she helped win the first wage increase in a Victoria's Secret flagship store of 700 plus employees and organized workers to win a racial discrimination case affecting black women workers across several Victoria's Secret locations. She is currently the executive director of CAV, organizing Asian communities, where she has helped lead campaigns, winning victories, securing dozens of Chinatown tenants' homes, and started the first project to organize Asian immigrant tenants living in New York City's public housing. Give it up for Cathy Dang. Next to Cathy, we have Kali Akuno. Kali is a co-founder and co-director of Corporation Jackson. He served as director of special projects and external funding in the mayoral administration of the late Chokwe Lumumba of Jackson, Mississippi. Kali also served as the co-director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, the executive director of the People's Hurricane Relief Fund, based in New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, and was a co-founder of the School of Social Justice and Community Development, a public school serving the academic needs of low-income African American and Latino communities in Oakland, California. Give it up for Kali. And last but certainly not least, we have Bhairavi Desai, who is the founding member of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, a union representing approximately 15,000 taxi drivers in New York City. She received a degree in women's studies from Rutgers University, and following that, she worked at Manavi, the South Asian women's organization in New Jersey that worked with victims of domestic violence. She then moved to working for the rights of Asian workers by joining the Community Against Asian American Violence in 1966, otherwise known as CAV. In 1998, she and others set up the NYTWA with an initial membership of 700 workers. Desai received the Ford Foundation's Leadership for a Changing World Award in 2005, 6, 7, and she is a regular contributor to forums and events at the New York Marxist School. Desai is a member of Crane's New York 2012 40 Under 40 class. Give it up. So, Ajamu, it's on you.
I'm going to go to the podium here to present my remarks. I want to thank the Left Forum for providing this opportunity for us to have this conversation. As you can see, with all of the very serious issues we have to face here in this country in building a viable left, we tend to get confused about who the enemy is. But I think that we are absolutely clear what we have to do here. We've got to organize ourselves. We've got to make sure that we keep the focus on the real enemy. Because basically, we have a certain responsibility here as residents and citizens at the center of empire. Our responsibility, no matter what we think about what's happening around the world, in any particular nation state, our responsibility is to put a brake on U.S. imperialism. So we are clear about that in the Black Alliance for Peace. We talk about peace, but we're not talking about bourgeois peace. We understand that without justice, there will be no peace. And we understand that to have justice, we have to fight for it. So in terms of how we see going forward and strategies for going forward, we are building this new formation, the Black Alliance for Peace. Its tagline is that it is a people-centered human rights project against war, repression, and imperialism. We say that if there's going to be an anti-war movement in this country, and it must be, that movement has to be also anti-imperialist. So we are clear about that in the Black Alliance for Peace. We're also clear as we go forward that we have to name the enemy. We see the Black Alliance for Peace as an integral part of the restructuring and reorganization of the Black liberation movement. This particular formation is part of that battlefield, if you will, that battlefront on this issue. We say that we have to name the enemy, and for us, the enemy is and remains the white supremacist, colonial, capitalist patriarchy. We say that if we're going to organize a left here in this country, we've got to name the enemy, have clear politics, and not be afraid to, in fact, push those politics. We say that at this point in history, there can be no confusion. We can't sugarcoat the fact that this system is in decline. But this system is also a very dangerous one. Therefore, we can't pretend that reform is even possible. We have to be honest with the people, tell no lies, and let people understand that the future that we are fighting for is going to be a future in which the kind of privileges we have in this country, even among workers, is going to have to change. Because we understand that those privileges have been based on the systematic exploitation and oppression of the world. And as the people of the world organize themselves and begin to take hold of their futures, begin to assert their own self-determination and national liberation, that the impact on that here in the North, in the U.S., and in Europe is that the privileges and lifestyles of the labor aristocracy, of the petty bourgeoisie, those privileges, that lifestyle will not be the same. So we must be clear about that and honest with the people. So as we go forward, we say that we have to have certain commitments in terms of how we organize the work. First, we have to recognize that one of the issues that we've got to have front and center is the issue of being opposed to war and U.S. imperialism. We have to have clear politics and have the confidence in the people to push those politics. And we can't be afraid of that S word, socialism. We have to be able to envision and to advance that vision. We can't just talk about what we are opposed to. It's not enough to have clear analysis. We have to have a vision that presents a real alternative. And the only alternative that I see, and I think most of you see, for us to address the issues that face humanity is a socialist revolution. And we can't be afraid to say that. We have to revive anti-imperialism. We know that there's a lot of confusion here in this country and even in Western Europe around how we should approach this question. We've got to be clear, my friends, and say that, no matter what we might think about what's happening in various nations, we could debate, revolutionary strategies. We've got to be clear about what our responsibilities are. We had a marvelous panel this morning where we talked about, looked at the situation in Venezuela. Very, very good conversation. We looked at the various social forces, the various interests that are clashing. We placed that within the context of global capitalism and the international balance of forces. Very good conversation. But one thing that we also did that was important, we said no matter what our different perspectives and positions may be on that experience in that country, we recognize, though, that when it comes to the attempts by this state to destabilize that experience, to intervene into their historical process, we recognize that our responsibility was to oppose that. So we have to revive anti-imperialism if we're going to go forward and build a viable left here in this country. To do that, we have to centralize certain issues. War, as I said, is one very important issue. We also have to look at this issue of militarism. In the Black Alliance for Peace, we are anti-war, anti-imperialism, but we connect that up with our concerns and our objectives to struggle against militarism domestically, against repression domestically. We look at issues like so-called gun control, and we say to the young people, we understand why you are taking your positions. But if you're concerned about so-called gun control and arms, connect that to a concern against war and aggression externally and domestically. We say we have to make those connections if we're going to be morally and politically consistent. We say join us, young people, in opposing the Department of Defense's 1033 program that transfers equipment from the U.S. military to these police forces. We say stand with us, young people, to oppose war and aggression across the globe. You can't be concerned about lives in the U.S. and not speak out about the brutality that we see in Gaza, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We've got to be morally and politically consistent. So this issue of war and militarism has to be front and center. Lastly, economic human rights. We say that most of the issues that we see that our people are struggling with stems from the fact that most people are denied their basic, fundamental human rights. That most people in this country are denied the ability to realize their full humanity, to be free of the fear of being unemployed, not having a way to pay your bills and to feed your family and feed yourself, not having a house to go to, not knowing where you're going to lay your head for millions of people in this country, not knowing whether or not you're going to be able to feed yourself, being afraid of getting sick because you don't have insurance, being exposed to pollutants in the air and in the ground. These are the elements that are being denied most people in this country. And we have to put that denial front and center as we organize here in this country. So economic human rights is an issue that I think all of us can agree on. So my friends, as we go forward, as we build this movement, as we attempt to live up to our responsibilities as citizens of the world, but in particular here in this empire, let us do this with the security of knowing that we are on the right side of history. That to build this movement is going to require struggle, debate, but we have no other choice but to, in fact, build this movement. The people of this country are waiting for that, and definitely the people of the world are waiting for us to get our act together here in this country. So we build, my friends, not based on what we can imagine. We build on what we have in hand in terms of our human material and the objective conditions. But we build, we organize, we struggle, and we're going to win. Thank you, my friends.
All right. Thank you, Ajamu. I should have said this earlier, but I would like, as each of you speak, for all of you to pay close attention, and obviously you're directing your remarks out here, but also if you can pick up threads from one another so that we try to have as linked a conversation as possible. So with that, Cathy, could you step up? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Honored to be here. I am the young person that's like sitting between very incredible people in this movement, so it's a real big honor to be on this panel. I've been asked by Rob to share about my recent delegation I went on to Vietnam and connecting it to US-based organizing here in the US as a grassroots organizer for many years now. So I was fortunate to have been on a US women's delegation to Vietnam. It was hosted by the Vietnam Women's Union. We got to meet with the Communist Party. And the Vietnam Women's Union just got to see the work from the very national scale to the city, to the very communal level. And it's an incredible, incredible organizing. And I had so many reflections, and I also had to tell myself when I came back to not romanticize everything that I was sitting with and be disappointed with US-based organizing. So I just had to keep reminding myself that, and also that we live in different contexts, we live in different conditions here in the US. And the conditions also is the folks that we organize here in the US, we come from different histories, we come from different migration and forced migration histories, and so it's a much different experience and challenges around organizing towards alignment, and still very necessary. But I wanted to talk more about the how pieces of how connecting to the bigger picture. And so as we are watching like the work of Jackson Rising and even work in Oakland, California around just transitions and San Francisco Rising, and even in New York City, we don't actually give ourselves enough credit around the public dollars that we move to support community land trusts and worker-owned cooperatives and investing in that. Those are shifts. It has to be coordinated shifts. These are shifts that we also have to celebrate. And that has to go in conjunction with how we build alignment and how we organize. So there are three areas that I learned coming back from Vietnam and connecting to grassroots organizing here. One is, yes, we have to be politically aligned. I was so impressed by the very communal level to the national level, how people were just so aligned, using words like building the capacity of our people. Like over here in the US, we're talking about how we don't have capacity. Over there, it's like we're continuing to build capacity of our people. And they're just politically aligned across the board of how they talk about the revolution in Vietnam. And then the second piece is how we actually build alignment and how we build up organizers and build infrastructure and structure to our work. So at the very local and national level, how are we building structure to how we organize? Some clear examples in the Asian communities, there's something called Seeding Change. It's a national organization where they're training up organizers, and in the same way in terms of how they do outreach and how they talk to people and how we're building people into the organizations, how we're doing politics, and how we're not afraid. I think I get so frustrated sometimes that some folks are so afraid to push politics and use the word socialism, and to push hard politics and challenge anti-blackness within our own communities, or homophobia. And we can't be afraid. We can't be afraid because liberation requires us to be more brave. So that's the second piece. And I think the third thing is how we develop organizers has to be on the same level. How one organization develops organizers, we should try to get on the same page with other organizations how we're developing organizers. That's how we get to the question of scale. I know for smaller organizations, we're challenged with scale often. But if we work in alliances, that's how we actually can talk and think about scale on a larger level. The other thing I wanted to touch on was how we build ecosystems in our work. So CAV are a very small organization, but we're part of alliances, and there's much bigger organizations like Chinese Progressive Association San Francisco in California, who've really taken on the role to help build infrastructure and an ecosystem in our communities. So they're a much larger organization who will throw down for small organizations to build ourselves up, to build infrastructure. And so if we want to talk about building a movement, we actually have to talk about an ecosystem in our organizations and how we're building across. And we have to contribute. So if we get to that point and we're able to help build that ecosystem, we have the responsibility to be building that ecosystem if we get to that point of being able to have that infrastructure. And something that I've been seeing lately is this whole riff and rife between old guard versus new guard. And I was talking to a lot of folks about this, these new people and these new young people, they're just sitting in their feelings all day long, and they just, which I get, they sit in their feelings all day long, and they just critique with no solution. Instant gratification and purism and perfectionism, short-term outlook. Yes, I get all of that, and it's frustrating. And there's also the old guard ways of burning yourself down to the ground, writing off young people and their experiences, which are also equally important to how we understand the conditions of now, living in scarcity and living in purely thoughts in the mind of analysis and not connecting back to feelings. And the reality is we actually need both. We need to be in touch with what we're feeling, but lead with what we're thinking, and combining both. When we met with the party in Vietnam, they often would use the word cooperation and struggle. They don't always get along with China, and there's a struggle over the South Sea, or the East Sea. There's debates on what the name of the sea is. But they kept emphasizing cooperation and struggle. So how do we adopt and continue to work through these challenges and cooperate and struggle with one another? And we have to think of new ways of moving forward and have perspective. And there are many lessons learned in history. Lessons that I am actually going to start, I'm actually transitioning out of CAV, and I'm going to start actually raising some of these things. CAV has a long history. It's becoming kind of an institution, and we've also made many mistakes as an organization. And what we learned from the party in Vietnam was about candor, and how candor actually moves us towards progress, and how we talk openly about our mistakes and our movements, not to air us out or call each other out, but talk about candor and to move us forward. So how do we F up in all these different ways as an organizations and decisions that we made to get to where we are today? Candor towards progress. And the last thing I want to touch on is perspective and camaraderie. So perspective, I went on this, actually, I'll get to camaraderie. But perspective, the first thing is, what I'm often seeing in our work is that some folks might feel like they're too good to do this work. We get to a certain point of this work. But the revolution requires plumbing. Trust me on that. Like, I went to Vietnam. You have a choice between a hole and a toilet. You prefer the toilet. But, we're never too good to be doing the hard, laborious work of our ancestors and our parents. My parents came from Vietnam. My family's been in Vietnam for 100 years and lived through, almost a century of struggle in Vietnam. And so, and then we came, and they were nail salon workers, and I grew up in the nail salon, touched acetone, did many pedicures my whole life up until I was 22. And so, acrylics are just, and I think there's also, OSHA violations and health-related issues that of course, is being fixed. But as organizers in this work, and as people are coming into this movement, we're never too good to do the laborious work that's required of us. We're never too good to pick up the garbage or clean and mop up the flood in the bathroom. We're never too good for that. And the last thing is camaraderie. So when I came back from Vietnam, there was a flood in my office because there was this blizzard, and it was freezing in New York, and our pipes froze, and I was so frustrated. And our ceiling collapsed, there was mold along the wall, and I, as the ED of a small organization, had to deal with all of that. And I was there, like, by myself, ripping up the floors. I'm, like, so miserable, just, like, ripping out the floors. I'm like, why am I doing this by myself? Because I just, like, wanted the staff to focus on the work. And I was so miserable, but I was thinking back, I went to the Cu Chi tunnels, where the Viet Cong lived in these tunnels for, like, years on end. And, like, how did they, like, live through these tunnels and get like blown out and like watered in and for years. And I can't even, be in this office by myself dealing with the dust and the mold and ripping out floors. I had to remind myself that there are 5,000 people living in those tunnels together. And there is camaraderie that they had and built with one another. And in order for us to move forward and how we practice our work as organizers and build our movement is that we have to continue building camaraderie. And, there was really clear examples in the last couple of years. I started off this work when there was 1 million people marching in LA against SB 1070 over 10 years ago. Or even the police brutality work in New York City and across the country, the marches that we're seeing. That level of camaraderie that we have to keep and maintain in order to believe moving forward. The last thing is, if we want to move our work forward and stay focused and keep ourselves in it, we have to have fun. I think people forget, however you define fun, whatever fun is to you, but fun is actually important and to keep us leveled for imagination, for love and hope, and community with other people.
Thank you, Cathy. Kali?
All right. It's going to be hard to follow up on fun. Well, good evening, everybody. I know many of you may want and expect like a whole analysis around Jackson, and we can maybe get into some of that. But I want to start on, since this is about moving forward, move beyond the experiment that we are engaging with on the short end and talk about some of the things I think we need to be looking at collectively in the long term. That our little project in Jackson, Mississippi is in part focused on. And there's two pieces I want to really focus on. One is the striving towards eco-socialism as a solution to two crises. One, the profound economic and social crisis that we've all been subjected to as a result of capitalism and imperialism the last 500 years. But the latter one is the ecological crisis, which threatens to just wipe all complex life on this planet out. And some of us in our local work have decided to give that more focus in urgency. And what brings that up is not something abstract, it's actually something very concrete, and that's the experience many of us had with Hurricane Katrina. And now you see even more so the effects of that and what's happening in Puerto Rico as more and more of that is becoming uncovered and unraveled. That the catastrophe level stage of climate change it's already been upon us. For some of us, we recognized that 12 years ago, and for others, you may have been even further back. But we're at that stage, and we have to build, in our view, a political movement that takes it seriously and is grounded in a practice which is actually going to build a way out of that particular dimension of the crisis. Now, with that, another major piece that I think many of us have tried to ground a practice in is how do we actually reconstitute the working class under the new conditions towards the project of emancipation, right? And that project must include dealing with the special issues of national oppression, race, gender, sexuality, ability as central pieces towards the emancipatory project. But I think for us, we have to recognize in the era that we are at, some of the methods that we've used in the past, particularly in this country, to try to organize our communities, you know, be it at the workplace and be in some other areas. The dynamic of neoliberalism basically underwrote those things about 30, 40 years ago. And we've been kind of hanging on to some of these forms just because we often don't want to think out the box or don't know what else to do. And I think that there are a number of different things that we need to really reinvent on, and that's a grounding piece of what our work around Jackson is really being focused on. And it started to a certain extent, and y'all got to forgive me, my voice is going in and out. I've been talking too damn much this weekend. It started in part with what Ajamu said, picking up on the theme. Like, you know, where are we concretely at? What do we concretely have? And then asking ourselves some new questions. And the thing that first forced many of us, you know, who wind up developing the Jackson Kush Plan, the thing that really forced us to start asking some new questions, first and foremost, the major catalytic force, was September 11th. And why? Because we were very clear that was going to be a turning point domestically, that the terror that, you know, the United States has been reigning on the world for most of the last 100 years was going to be inwardly focused in a new and more profound way. Not that it hasn't been that way before. You know, ask almost any black person in here about that, they'll tell you. But we knew it was going to intensify in some critical ways, and that meant that we had to do our work in some profoundly different ways and change up a number of different things. Now, we didn't solve that all in like one piece. It was kind of experimental over the course of the next years. And then it was Hurricane Katrina that really brought us into a focus in on what could those of us who were working on that plan, what could we do concretely and where? That's what really led us to Jackson, Mississippi. You know, it was an analysis, a concrete analysis based on a plan and based on some organizing history and work. But it wasn't just in terms of what I mean by looking and asking ourselves some new questions. it started off with what are the strengths that already exist in that community organically? And then what could we do to a certain extent to enhance upon that? Now, many people might, take that to mean kind of old school organizing thing where you start with what the people want. And we started in a little different dimension of saying like there are a number of different things that are already there, particularly in the realm of like the solidarity economy, which are not formally organized, but which are necessary for the people in those conditions as they exist in Mississippi to actually survive. And nobody came and taught people how to share with each other, be it paying your somebody's phone bill, your cousin's phone bill, your mama paying your utility bill. Nobody taught us those things. Those are things that were happening organically because they were necessary for our people's survival. And the thing that we asked ourselves, well, how do we take that particular element of solidarity that already exists, move it from an informal practice to a formal practice, and then use that as political leverage to change the economy? That's the core piece of what became a cornerstone of how we articulate the solidarity economy and some of the things that we wanted to start with. And I'm bringing that up as an example because I think we have to ask, if we're going to have a new vision going forward, we got to ask ourselves some new questions, that lead us into some new practices of how we are actually engaging and building power. Now, that don't mean you throw everything old out. I'm not saying that in the least, right? But we have to look at some of the things that we pursue as to what end does it actually serve. And so I'm going to speak to that piece around some of our focus around electoral politics. Now, we know historically on the left, this question around electoral politics in the United States has been and is going to continue to be a divide, right? But I think if we ask ourselves in a particular sense, to the degree that we're pursuing electoral offices within this empire where we know the fundamental rules of the game and the structure are not going to change, what is the actual agency that the people that we might put in those places, what might they actually have? What might they actually do? And how do we shift the locus? And that brings me to the third. I'm trying to go through the different elements of the little program that we built and ask on the basis of the questions that we've kind of focused and shaped. And that's where we feel ultimately we have to build an alternative set of institutions that practice democracy on a participatory and a grassroots level to be a real leverage and a counter, a dual power, I'm going to use that up front, to the state as it actually exists in this country and in this empire. Because it's at that level that we're going to build, I think, the constituted force to be able to transform the society. And to think that we're going to do that through the instrument of the Democratic Party or we're going to do that through the instrument of the Green Party, I'm going to just say up front, I think is ludicrous. Now, that doesn't mean those tools can't be used to push little pieces forward of what our overall agenda is. But if we think they're going to be the housing element of where we put all of our energy and attention, I think we going down the wrong path. And the path is how do we actually enable the overall capacity of our people with a concrete program which is aimed directly towards not only possessing and controlling the means of production, but doing it in such a way that it's regenerative of the ecology and the environment. Now, ain't nobody in this world figured it out exactly how to do that yet. But we have to ask ourselves some new questions. How do we struggle to do production, distribution, consumption, recycling in such a way that constitutes an organic whole that is replenishing the earth and not depleting it from it? And we got to take that particular task, I would argue, seriously. Because I think, by all accounts, the clock is ticking real fast. And we better, step up to the challenge of addressing it and dealing with the rabid nature of imperialism at this stage of the game, which is fully prepared to eliminate all those that it deems to be totally dispensable, which is becoming the vast majority of humanity. Right, as one of my comrades and co-workers said, there's a whole bunch of useless eaters on the planet now as far as the system is concerned. And ultimately, there are programs that they're going to have to institute to balance that out. And that's why we would argue there's some serious conversations that are had amongst elements of the ruling class that you all know about how do you do population, reduce the population and those things. We got to take that serious, just as serious we got to take them trying to go to the moon and go to Mars, right? Like that's not a speculative activity. Because what that says to me on a certain level, and I'll end here, and we can deal with more about the division piece, clearly, that these folks, rather than deal with the contradictions of the system here, they'd rather leave us all burning in hell and take a private party with their friends to Mars and perpetuate the madness there. And that constitutes a legitimate discussion and program that's happening right now. Think about that. I want y'all to really think about that. Elon Musk is running around talking about this like this is a legitimate pursuit. And we just accept it like, okay, well, I guess Star Trek is real, or, we at that stage of the game. He ain't talking about taking you along. Ain't none of us gonna be on that. But he's gonna take all of our resources, him and his friends are gonna take all of our resources and our labor to make that possible if we enable them to do that. So I think there's a serious task that we have in front of us. Now, I think the basic elements that we say that need to be combined. Number one, we have to really reunite the solidarity economy with what poses as the labor movement in this country. The bridge between those two pieces basically has to end. We definitely need to struggle with all our folks in the formal organized labor union movement in this country to recognize that the National Labor Relations Act regime is basically done, it's finished, and we're going to have to fight on some new terms and recognize in part the opportunity that getting out of that shell actually presents to us in a number of different ways. And then the other thing I think we're going to definitely have to fight for is a much more radical-oriented independent politics, right, with the independent agenda that represents our collective interests, and then marry that with that grassroots political force and that dual power that we need to be building in all our neighborhoods, street by street, block by block. I think that is a concrete road to the future that we could all employ based upon the different conditions we face in either in the urban environments that we're in or the rural environments that we're in to build some concrete power that's transformative towards a radical agenda. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, colleague. Bhairavi?
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Mark. Gosh, that was so great, and it gave me so much to think about. So I'm gonna try to take up Mark's request of us to follow up, right, on what we've heard.
Yes,
okay.
thank you.
But before I do that, I do just want to say one thing that's really important to me about the introduction of where I work, the Taxi Workers Alliance. We are the organization that in January of 2017 struck at JFK taxi lot in opposition to the Muslim ban. Yeah. It was an amazing moment for us. We had no idea that the world was watching. We're out there protesting. We got back home at like 1, 2, 3 in the morning and realized that Delete Uber was trending nationally because while our members were out on strike, of course, Uber dropped its rates to encourage people to go out to the airport. But one backstory to that strike for us is it was only possible because it wasn't our first one, right? We'd had many strikes at the airport before, and the reason we went out on strike at the airport taxi lot that day, when we saw the protesters gathering at the terminal, we knew that we needed to do something to give support to the protesters. And we believe that if we shut down the airport lot, that the police forces of the Port Authority would be completely divided. And we knew that because just about 5-6 months prior to the strike on that day, we had also shut down Kennedy Airport. I mean, there was no media, there were no cameras there at the time. But we had actually shut down Kennedy Airport, the taxi lines, because one of our members, we were getting ready for a demonstration the next day in front of the governor's office. And one of our members who was leafleting to fellow drivers and in the middle of his shift while his taxi was parked in the lot, was assaulted by a group of dispatchers. And then the cops came in and went to arrest him. And so we shut down the lot. We had dozens of our members, and it's a huge lot that holds up to 700 taxis at one time. So there's hundreds of drivers there. And, many of our members sat on the ground and wouldn't let any of the taxis out. And within minutes, right, Port Authority had the entire lot surrounded by tow trucks, and there were dogs, and there were, cops in riot gear. It was just us to defend ourselves in that moment. And so we knew that if we were to shut it down again, that the police would not know how to respond to us and respond to the protesters at the terminal at the same time. And I have to say, in all our years of organizing, that moment, when I think about what should the labor movement look like in our country, I can't help but to feel like in that moment, the courage and the vision of our members that shut down that lot really answer that question for me in such a profound way. After the Arab Spring, right, unions across the Arab world had this amazing rise in membership. Right? There were unions talking about how they couldn't keep up with the number of folks that wanted to sign. And that's because for folks in the Arab world, they could connect those movements. The democracy and liberation movements could be directly connected to the role that unions had played in civil society in really difficult times, but also the role that they had played, at the time of the Arab Spring itself. But in the U.S., we don't have that kind of an analogy. You would have, during the Occupy movement, for example, many folks would have thought that we would have seen a rise in union membership, right? First of all, it would be hard to see those numbers because, as Kali was saying, too much of the union movement is dependent on the National Labor Relations Board telling us whether or not we have members. That the members only get counted once you're able, to win a contract or, to win an election. But really, not even then. It's really when you're able to win the contract. In other words, when the bosses have been forced to come to the table to recognize you. But that's not what should give you recognition. What makes a union is, it's an organization that's democratically organized and represented by the workers who have come together to defend themselves. And that could be outside of the NLRB, as we've been doing for 22 years, or even if it's within the recognition of the NLRB. And I don't want to downplay how important collective bargaining is and how important that recognition needs to be. Not for the sake of the union, but for the sake of maintaining our civil society and even, the illusions of democracy. But even when you have that recognition, if the workers aren't the ones that are controlling their organization and their destiny, and their rights within that local economy in that industry, that's not a union. That's a collective bargaining agent. And I would argue that they really are two different things. Union to me, it's the more political, it's the more ideological definition of what it means for workers to come together and fight for their own self-determination. So, at the end of the Occupy movement or throughout the Occupy movement, we couldn't count all these numbers because we don't have an organized union movement that understands that we need to find new ways of calculating our membership and understanding the level of support, grassroots worker support that we as workers' organizations have. But we also couldn't calculate those numbers because the reality is there was a large disconnect between, a grassroots movement by activists, by, primarily young activists, right, and organized labor. Organized labor was not at the heart of that movement. Or there were many organizations, many labor unions that I think did great work in supporting Occupy, but of course, we as a labor movement have absolutely no claim in saying that we were at the heart of why Occupy happened. Similarly, when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think is probably the most important grassroots movement, certainly in my generation, you don't see a connect. Yeah. We still don't see that connect, right? That translates into either a membership that broadens out the labor movement, or even a more of an ideological shift within the labor movement itself that has got to recognize that racism and capitalism are two sides of the same coin, and unless we as a left, are push ourselves to have those conversations that recognizes the ways in which racism is so deeply entrenched in our society and in our economy, we will fail to rebuild our society. And of course, for me, when I think of those two sides of that coin, the name of that coin is imperialism. And yet, we have a labor movement that doesn't challenge itself on these larger social ideological questions. Instead, we're too busy being bureaucrats and technocrats, right? Which is even when we look at the split between the AFL and Change to Win all those years ago was about. It was an internal power play. It was not an ideological shift, which is really what we need in the labor movement. First and foremost, we need a labor movement that's politically independent from the Democratic Party. We as a movement, right, as an institution right now, we end up really being a lapdog to that party. A party that in so many ways has sold its soul to Wall Street. There's an important internal struggle that's going on within the party that we in the left have to push, right? Because if we don't push for those internal debates, then the party is only going to move even further to the right. And so I think it's important that we have that. But I also think it's important that unless the labor movement is seen as its own independent political vehicle, it will always get used by the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party will have absolutely no reason to genuinely distance itself from Wall Street and all the titans of capital. The labor movement has it's not only a necessity that the Democratic Party distance itself from Wall Street, but really the labor movement can be the catalyst to make that happen. We still are the most organized force of people in this society. The labor movement has tremendous power. The problem is that it has been for far too long a tool of capital rather than being a vehicle of change, particularly for the working class. And I know that so well just from the day-to-day grassroots that we do, work that we do in our industry. Where companies like Uber, which represent less than 1% of the economy, but in more than half the states across the country, they have one deregulation bill where if you are a worker and the boss is an app company, you can no longer be considered an employee. And these are not all Republican-dominated states by any stretch of the imagination. And so we, in order to rebuild the labor movement in this country, obviously, there's no doubt that means it has to be a labor movement that is based on class-conscious unionism and not on business unionism. And so that means that we need that left, that those of us who come from the left and are part of the labor movement, we have to find more ways of engaging the movement that we are a part of. And we need a left that supports that effort. We cannot have a left in this country that is either confused around issues of imperialism or is really blind to the significance and the role of labor. And there are too many left spaces where that does happen. Just because it's an institution itself that is deeply problematic, and flawed, it does not mean that the labor movement as a whole is something that we should take for granted. The left needs to find ways to inject new organizing and have more young activists join the labor movement. We need to take that movement over because it's still the biggest vehicle of change that we have within this economy and, really within our society. And I think when the disconnect happens from the Democratic Party, you'll also see a labor movement that begins to invest more in organizing, in grassroots organizing, and not so much, in the top-down business unionism that you see of today. And just really, very lastly, I just want to say that I think part of the point that Kali was making, and I think Cathy as well, it's true that when we think of the labor movement, we often focus on, the large institutions, the big unions and the federation. I happen to be a board, an executive committee member of the AFL-CIO. We were the first non-traditional union that was chartered actually by the AFL-CIO for membership. But really, I think what we have to focus on is a broader working class movement that also looks at, grassroots organizing like by worker centers, which are doing some of the most confrontational, anti-capitalist, militant organizing that's out there. And they are part of the reason. And, that organizing is part of the reason that you see a pressure on local unions, maybe not at the national level, but on local unions to become more militant and class conscious and to be more democratically organized, at the local level. And so we need to also support more work by worker centers and push worker centers to be more membership driven and to be more mass-based driven because, we can't have a disconnect where the largest mass-based organizations in our country are so depoliticized, which is just a fancy way of saying that they're ideologically centered on the right, while we have, the more militant grassroots organizing remain too small in numbers. We need a large mass-based movement in order to create real change, given the forces that we're up against. And I think the left has a real role to play to be a bridge between, these two factions of the larger workers' movement in this country.
Thank you. Excellent. Wow, I think you've set the table, all of you, for a really great conversation, but let's check in on time. What time do we have to Rob? 6:15? Okay, great. So we have there's something to work with here. So there are a lot of things I want to pick up on, and I want to start with Bhairavi. You're talking about imperialism and the two coins of it being racism and capitalism, and kind of focus outwardly at the moment on the capitalism side of that. I also want to pick up on the fact that, Cathy talked about us being open about our mistakes and speaking with candor. That's really important. And I know I'm going to ask impossible questions at this moment that are so big, and it's hard to sort of fit them in a few minutes, but this is the hand I've been dealt. Kali said something in the spirit of candor. I think Kali said, he talked about Jackson and what was happening there and framed it as an experiment. And I so appreciated your use of that term because I've been involved in experiments for 30 years. And there's a particularly strong and I think exciting solidarity economy experiment going on in New York City right now, and a lot of energy around that. And so I would like, if y'all can just talk about where we are as far as getting it from, when we talk about solidarity and mainstreaming socialism and participatory democracy and cooperativism and workers-centered enterprise, where are we right now in terms of mainstreaming that? So that's one small question. And the other one is, where can we make that shift? If you can point to any examples of where you see this sort of cultural shift becoming mainstream. So it's not just on the fringe. We're not just talking about it in terms of alternative, but it has started to sort of capture more broadly the society that we're in. I know there's some big-ass questions, but...
New York.
New York.
I mean, I think now this is from a view from Jackson, so take it with perhaps a grain of salt.
Right, as we in New York are looking dreamy-eyed towards you. Right.
No, but I mean, as Omar Freya was saying earlier, and something I noted, like New York now constitutes the largest concentration of worker cooperatives in the country. That's a growth that's only happened, I think, within the last 2 or 3 years. But I think it's profound and significant that it is happening here. It was something strategically that we need to happen here. I think it's something strategically that we need to happen here. I think it may seem a bit challenging here just because of the scale of the beast that is New York City. So it looks like or feels like to y'all a drop in the bucket. But from a national perspective, it's already having a fairly profound impact at mainstreaming, if you would, the concept in new corners and new ways that I think we just couldn't do in Jackson on a certain level. We don't have the access to media and the access to capital and the access to the raw number of people that you all have. So I think sometimes scale and scope is a question of your own location and positionality. But looking at it from a whole, even though it may be only I think somebody estimated maybe 10,000 people involved directly in worker co-ops here, that's still significant on a national level, just given the projection of what's going on, that I think is doing a good deal, at least as we see it, a good deal of legitimizing our work to forces in our own community. So it's reverberating back, I think, in some positive ways.
Thank you. Go for it.
I think what had helped when I was on that delegation to Vietnam and how the party talks about they're in transition towards socialism. They haven't actually yet arrived at socialism in Vietnam. And I think in the context of the U.S., if we want to de-silo this big mythical socialism, it's actually start thinking that we are in process right now. There's still aspects that we have to celebrate. And so in addition to the co-ops, there's shifts towards supporting community land trusts throughout New York, which seems almost impossible because there's just not a lot of public land left. So the idea that we can even move public dollars towards supporting community land trusts is a huge victory. But participatory budgeting is, recent victories in New York. And I think we're challenged with a lot of critiques of these recent, these small wins. But if we don't actively engage and try to build in within these small wins, I don't know what else we can possibly do. And then I think what I mentioned earlier around these small wins, we actually have to talk about, when I talk about coordinating these wins, we actually have to think about the overall shifts of economy, like our entire economy in New York City, and it's much more unruly in New York because there's so many people. But we have to talk about the whole entire picture of community land trust, how we're actually shifting banking and organized labor, all of this together, and how we're scaling up in our mass organizing.
Thank you.
You know, I wonder, though, we seem to have both a political and a cultural challenge that we have to recognize and address. And that is, you know, I get a chance to get around this country, and I see there's a lot of good work being done. Right. Everybody is organizing. But what we are defining as organizing seems quite different to me. I'm not seeing a lot of the old-fashioned face-to-face organizing in the kitchens and front rooms that I recognized before, that also reflected effective organizing. And that's not happening, I think, because there's been a cultural shift in terms of the deterioration of civic life, that people are not socializing like we did some decades ago. People are not visiting one another. We don't have very many civic organizations. So the whole notion of how we in fact relate to people and build and deepen social relations is almost lost. And therefore, face-to-face organizing is almost becoming a lost art. So the challenge of having to build alternative structures and institutions, and that's what we're talking about. When we talk about trying to build a revolutionary movement, we're talking about building alternative structures and institutions within the context of already existing dominant institutions. That's why they're alternative. But, you know, we haven't been that effective at doing that. So I wonder, how do we address these cultural changes? How do we get to a point in a place where we can go back and do the kind of effective political education we used to do also? We can't even talk about, you know, why we need to be raising the issue of socialism when we can't even get access to the people, you know? So when you have a more vibrant civic environment, then you see the consequence in terms of organizing. Very quick story. As many of you know, I spent a lot of my time in Colombia. And in that country, there's still a civic culture and a tradition of organizing. And so the standards and measurement of success is a lot different than what I see here. A couple of years ago, my partner, who's in the leadership of one of the main Afro-Colombian organizations, they went to meet with one of the local bureaucrats. And in that meeting, this was on a Wednesday afternoon, the folks were pretty disrespectful to the activists. And so the activist said, the bureaucrat. So the activist said, okay, so since you're not going to respect us and you're not going to respond to us correctly, we tell you what, ain't nobody going home this afternoon. We're going to take this building. And they took the office and they took the building. It's on Wednesday evening. Friday morning, I talked to my partner and she was upset because they put a call out. They said they wanted people to come and join them to occupy this building. So Friday morning, I talked to her. She said, "Yeah, I'm really upset." I said, "Why?" "Because we didn't get the kind of response that we should have." I said, "Well, how many people are inside the building?" She said, "We only got about 250 people." And we got 30 people outside who are organizing the food. And I'm thinking, in this country, for us to mobilize in a day and a half 250 people, and you ain't sending people plane fares and tickets and stuff, it ain't gonna happen, you know. But that's the kind of organizing that we've got to get to some kind of way.
Thank you.
Well, I think you'll appreciate this story. That 2007, we went out on strike, and we don't have a strike fund, right? Drivers are considered independent contractors. There's no paychecks in the industry, and the way we organized the strike is there are all these friendship groups, And so for each group of like 20 drivers, one would be in charge of collecting all the keys for the taxis so that nobody could go out and, scab for the day, right? And, but it was, we ended up having a strike of about 30,000 workers. And I mean, and that's really how it got built up. I have to say, I don't know if I'm as optimistic as to what's happening in this city. I mean, New York City now has the highest income inequality of any city in the country. And New York State has the highest of any state in the country as well. And just to give you a context of like the world that we work in terms of, the gig economy, an average CEO makes like 271 times more, right, than their average employee salary in the overall economy. In the gig economy, Uber driver that earns even $35,000 a year, compared to the Uber CEO, the CEO makes 5,700 times more than that driver. And some of you may have heard over the past 5 months, we've had suicides by 5 drivers in New York City. 2 livery drivers, a black car driver, and 2 yellow cab driver. And, these are all men in their late 50s and 60s. And it's the growing, poverty that people are just facing every single day in this city. You're working 12, 14 hours a day. I think that's also part of why you don't have more of a civic society. People are just really exhausted, right? Everyone is just working longer, and you have less time available to you, and then on top of that, there's just more exhaustion. And hearing stories from workers that work 12, 14 hours, still talking about hunger, food scarcity, not having enough for healthcare, but just even the most basics of like being able to eat every day and not having to skip a meal as an adult. I think that there's such a deepening poverty in our city, and I think part of the reason that you have lots of these like contradictions, as I would call them, is we still have a political environment where the movements that win are the ones that have political connections. It's it's even on the grassroots level, you're expected to have a lobbyist, right? Or you're supposed to have access to some lobbyist who might volunteer for you while, others are kind of paying their bills. I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong with that kind of a politics. And even though we live in a city with, one of the most progressive city councils, almost exclusively all Democrats, it's still that same kind of politics that's expected. Right? And so you still don't have a political leadership that recognizes certain inequities and feels a moral calling to legislate around those issues, even if there wasn't a grassroots effort that's pushing things along. And I know that might sound really, unrealistic. We know that change only happens in the political arena when there's been a fight on the streets, and this fight on the streets only happen when people are being organized. But I do think that there is something to be recognized that, that there's such a moral bankruptcy that on any kind of an issue of fairness, of like humanism, in this day and age, it's not just a grassroots movement isn't even enough. You need access to lobbying, and you need access to political money in order to be heard. And, New York City still has that same kind of, business as usual politics. And I think that we need to find a way for, the progressive movement in this city to really challenge that and to bring about a new kind of politics where, that doesn't depend on lobbyists. Like, even if it's lobbying from our side, that's still a problem. It's still a problem if that's the only way that change really happens, right? It's still a problem where you have such a deepening poverty in this country that we have, when you look at the numbers of like mass incarceration, you look at how much, public education is fleeting and how many people in our communities have less and less access to it. These should be certain universal issues that particularly in a so-called progressive city with the progressive political bodies these are issues that should be able to be taken up on their own without requiring, the kind of movement work that it still does. Because that can't be our starting point, right? If these things don't get taken on independently by a political body that recognizes its moral responsibility, then these most basic issues, they remain our starting point. And so when we look at issues of inequality, the gaps just keep getting bigger and bigger. Because if all we're expected to talk about are, for example, issues of minimum wage, that's the floor. We shouldn't have to begin at a freaking floor. If we're supposed to raise that ceiling, then this can't be where we start things off. And so we need to find a way of, changing the political structure so that we're not constantly beginning here. And so, that there's a higher calling at play.
Wow, yeah. Carly, you wanted to respond?
I mean, not so much a response, but just to note that, this alienation that you're talking about, both of you are talking about, that's also a crisis for the other side. When I got off the plane to get here, there's a campaign that I saw on several subways. I wish I could project this. So on many of these subways, there's this whole campaign that's at least in 7 different languages that says, feel alone, we're here to talk. That's through all around these subways. And it just immediately reminded me of the need that's happening in the UK. They've created some new office here recently, or maybe it's a cabinet position within the Labour Party, I'm not quite sure. But they appointed somebody to be a minister of loneliness, right? So the level of alienation and social fragmentation that neoliberalism as a particular project has done, I think we have to be honest in recognizing how effective it actually has been. But we have to recognize also that I think it's becoming a crisis for capital on the other end, because I think it's also beginning to break some of the bonds of the consumer aspect of the culture that the system itself depends upon. So they're running into, I think, some limitation as to who's going to buy all the shit that they produce, to be able to realize, the profits in the real way, outside of all the fictitious things that they make from the derivative and the speculation. But in the real world, who's consuming? And if that is breaking down, and there's a lot of studies where I'm connecting it, where that is actually breaking down amongst youth. They are not to the same degree consumers that my generation was. And that's a trend I don't think that many people expected. And definitely the calculus around how the system was perpetuate itself was not counting on the downward trend. Now, some people might say, because there's also some studies that are out there that saying the generation that got born basically in the 1980s, I forget what they call y'all, but the folks who were born from the 1980s on, who grew up, coming of age in the midst of the economic crisis from 2006 to the present, but basically 2008, that generation is never going to recover or get on a good grounding. So the material basis for them to be able to consume on a certain level may have also been eliminated. So, I think there's some deeper aspects to this fragmentation piece that we have to look at from another piece, recognize the weakness that exists on our side of the equation, but also recognize the problem and the contradiction that it's also posing for the system itself. Because I think there's some strategy that we need to figure out that I think it's not just organizing. I think we have to figure out a new way of actually producing culture as a reason why people want to come out of an alienated existence. And I don't think just knocking on doors saying, well, me and you share the same interests. You know, I know that, I was schooling that. It has diminishing returns. You know, because I think it just doesn't speak to a part of what you were talking to. There's something like, there's just a joy in a reason to get up in the morning that many people are beginning to lack, right? That just meeting with me in a meeting and talking about our misery is not gonna cut it.
Wow, thank you. I want to shift gears a little bit, because what I want to do is flip the coin that you talked about before, Bhairavi, that is the imperialist coin. So we've talked a little bit about capitalism, the dimensions of that. I want to talk about race and racism. I think that look, let's just, again, we're going to be real and speak with candor. We look around the room and we recognize that, you know, it's a reminder that when we talk about the left, that there's some serious gaps that have to be bridged. So I guess my question is, one, how do we begin to address white supremacy within the left movement? And are you seeing some, again, trying to always bring it back to some, if there are some examples that we can raise up and get some inspiration from, do you see any evidence of white supremacy, you know, being challenged effectively and gaps, that is, racial gaps being filled and overcome?
Was that to anybody?
That was to anybody.
I will start very briefly by suggesting, because you framed the beginning of the question related to the issue of imperialism. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, what we see, what we saw at the beginning of this this evening was an example of the psychopathology of white supremacy, in the sense that there's a notion that that's been naturalized that white folks should be running things, and that it is quite natural that the U.S. should be determining the leadership of various nations, that the U.S. and Western Europe have a right and a responsibility to be the police persons of the planet, that people don't see the contradiction of the concern about so-called foreign intervention in the elections in the U.S. When the U.S. is actively and obviously, openly intervening in the election process in Venezuela. So that inability to even see these contradictions, to me, is a reflection of that kind of pathology. What we saw with the demonstration was this notion, this was the left version of American exceptionalism. That even white leftists can determine who they're going to support based on whether or not these forces inside these countries measure up to their whatever, you know, their measurement is. If they don't, then basically they're going to objectively side with U.S. imperialism, while U.S. imperialism is mashing up their nation. So, you know, these are, for me, the manifestations in terms of imperialism that we see connected to the inability to confront firsthand the assumptions of white supremacy and to defeat it.
I just had a clear example. So in New York, we have really principled ways of how we do our work in action. Like even when it comes to direct actions, whoever is directly impacted are the people who are the very front of the marches. So in police brutality work, the families are the very front. Black communities are the very front. Trans and queer folks are the front who are impacted by policing in New York. So there's also white allies who don't bombard us with a million questions, with like how to support us, but when we give a directive, know what to do and resolve it within themselves. So I had an issue with neighbors who were calling the cops on our long time, and I live in Brooklyn now. I grew up in Ridgewood, Queens. I lived not that far, and I had these new neighbors who've been calling the cops on the old long-time neighbors. So I was going to knock on doors on myself, as you know, because I'm a housing organizer. But Surge, showing up for racial justice, chapter in Brooklyn, they was suggested that have them do it. So I just made one ask. I need somebody to knock on these new buildings, on all these doors, and to neutralize these people from calling the cops on the long-time residents. And all they did was send me the script, what's the context? They wrote the script, they developed all the fault materials, the contact information, so that it wasn't just like a one-off door knocking, they were gonna follow up with them. And after that, that one particular woman, she committed to, I haven't seen the cops ever since, and there was like 2 new buildings with at least dozens more new people living in the building. And we haven't seen that as an issue. But I just want to give a clear example of the role of white folks in the left to do it principally.
Thank you. And if you listen to Third Rail, which is Brooklyn Movement Center's podcast, we actually talk about, Surge is represented, we talk about this whole issue of when you call the police, when you call 911.
Did you want to say something? Okay. Well, as I was listening to you, I was thinking really the thing that came to my mind was, the question of Palestine. I still think, when I look at my own experience in the left in this country and just, the anti-war movement, I still think that, Palestine and, Palestinian liberation still strikes me as the most difficult, I think, conversation that still had to be had within the U.S. left, with a certain, with the clarity that doesn't have conditions and, conditions on it, as opposed to, when there's been more clarity, I think, in the past about other anti-war movements, but you don't see that around questions of Palestine in particular. And, when you look at in this present moment, what's happening within the Middle East as a whole, right? There's a lot of confusion, I think, within the U.S. left on how to respond to to these issues around, U.S. intervention. And I think part of that really is, it's just a reflection of an internalized Islamophobia. That it's not the questions are not so much about the role of the U.S., but the question becomes more about, the folks that are overseas. That there's there's a, diluting of the humanity of the folks overseas, that we should be standing in non-confused, non-compromised solidarity with. And, you see it in this country. I think you see it across Europe as well. I think some of the questions around, immigration, particularly in the European context, have definitely brought a lot of this to surface. But I think also within the U.S., and I think that it is in these moments where the left lacks a clarity on what is our historical role in terms of the moral role that we play, right? Beyond our ability to analyze power and the system. I think that when you have these moments of confusion, much of that for me is where the elements of white supremacy really get reflected, or just the ways in which, these long-standing issues, really get internalized within the left. And I think what's really dangerous is we live in a political time right now, though, where, you have a real, you have a real fascist sympathizer in power. And if the left is not able to get past a lot of this, lack of clarity, then we're not going to build a real movement that can actually challenge, I think, a fascism that will set into this country far faster, right? Than if we don't have our own act together to have the clarity to really call out some of these things. But I think some of it is also reflected in just kind of there tends to be this like knee-jerk reaction to, I think, finding ways to almost excuse away some of the white supremacy that you see growing in this country, or not to take it as seriously, almost to have a certain kind of a, in certain circles, it'll be like almost certain kind of a hope that, like, if we just talk things out, everything will be just fine. And I think, the solutions here are much deeper than just in a dialogue and confrontation. That these are regressive forces that are supported by resources and people in power. Right? That it's not just about dialogue, but it's actually about confronting the institutions that are supporting this ideology, and particularly when you have, police forces, both, at the local level, but now at the federal level, that are committed to really, I think, unleashing white supremacy on a much deeper level in this country than we've seen in the most recent generations. I think it's an incredibly serious and dangerous threat that I'm not sure that we as a left have really grasped enough how pervasive it is in this society. Right? That it's beyond the certain marches that we've seen, that it's much more institutionalized, and it's becoming a lot more powerful in this country because of the forces that now have political control here. And so I think we have to find a way of having more clarity and, having more discussions that analyze the institutions that support white supremacy in this country, and being a left that is uncompromisingly, united to take it on, with the understanding that we have to build a broad-based movement in order to really confront that power.
I see Rob lurking. So
lurking in the background, unfortunately, this conversation was deep and should have continued. You have some words you want to say? Go ahead.
Well, it depends on how deep we want to go.
Well, I love all y'all. I could stay up here till 11 o'clock.
Well, one thing I want to add, both to the international part of this question, and then I think I'm trying to gauge how deep down this rabbit hole I really want to go in a limited time. But I think we need to dispel part of this notion that Trump represents something new.
exactly.
That's
True.
That's number one. Them folks been here. They ain't never gone nowhere. And I think we act with a degree of amnesia in remembering that David Duke and many others like him were elected officials in the 1980s. And we forget that Ronald Reagan, when he announced his presidency in 1979, he did that in Mississippi at the site where Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were executed, sending a clear message to the white folks, particularly in the South, who he was, what he was about, what he was prepared to do, and what alliances that he was anchoring himself in. Now, the difference, that if you want to say that there was a difference in the world between then and now, that racist bullshit on a certain level was contained because there was the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and other countries that were still pertaining to be socialism that were counterweights to some of that madness on the international level. The other difference was you were still, there were still active forces of resistance within the Black Liberation Movement, the Chicano Liberation Movement, the Puerto Rican Liberation Movement, the American Indian Movement that were on the ground here in the United States that were a living example and still engaged in certain types of resistance openly and affrontedly to the system that was going on. You don't have that now. Both of those forces are gone, right? Both of those forces are gone. Now, objectively, those movements are still with us to a certain extent, but we're not having no real conversation about resistance because that's one of the things, to a certain extent, let's be real, got eliminated in September 11th. See, I was part of an organization that we very deliberately, to a certain extent, stopped talking about socialism and national liberation and start just having this amorphous conversation about transformation because we were, to a certain extent, trying to play into the game of not being labeled a terrorist, knowing that that's what was coming down after September 11th. So these dynamics have been creeping up on us because we allowed this bullshit to happen. Let's be real about that. And I think the last piece what I was saying about going down the rabbit hole, see, I think some of the confusion is not necessarily a confusion of the left. At least we can debate what that means, but at least how I see that entity, it's a small fraction of the United States society, number one. But I think our greatest confusion is that we keep trying to have an unprincipled alliance with liberals in this country. Exactly. And we're not willing to challenge the liberals on a serious and hardcore basis because, in part, all of us, to a certain extent, have been on the stage, to my knowledge, or to a certain degree, and it's not just a criticism, this is objective reality that we face, but we now in a situation where the movement itself has been NGOized, and it's the liberals who are the foundation of the finance of that politic.
We get no money from any liberal NGO at all. Black Alliance for Peace.
Not bad, right? But I'm saying in terms of the dynamic, we want to understand the politics that we have, in this current moment and what its limitations are. We are in a certain relationship with liberals that is confining, and we need to deal with that reality. And we got to figure out a concrete strategy to work our way out of that, right? And that comes with our movements trying to figure out, I would argue in part, was trying to be subtle about, we have to find some way in which, we at least enable ourselves to be able to reproduce our own organizers, right? Through the resources that we generated and we control, and whatever little means of production that we can control it in this day and age, so we're not dependent upon their largesse or their beneficence, and then the limitations of the politics that come with that. We need to be able, in the ultimate run, to be able to tell them, like we tell the other side of the equation, the far right, where to go and how to get there, right? And I think it's on that basis that the clarity that the folks have been, been waiting for will emerge, and then the folks that you were talking about, Ajamu, who have fundamentally basically turned off from politics, because I would argue the vast majority of these people in this country, this is just my own belief, they ain't stupid. By no stretch of the imagination. But it's not like on a certain level, even within the left, we have the boldness backed up by a practice which says, I'm taking what, we are collectively taking what is rightfully ours and what we have built, and we are asserting control of it. Since we're not having that conversation, and it's increment by increment, it winds up being, you just sound like a more radical version of the liberal I heard or the conservative I heard. What's the concrete difference between you and everybody else? And if you can't show a concrete difference, I'm not going, most folks I think objectively are sitting there, I'm not going to sacrifice my time, energy, and ultimately my person fighting the system if I don't see that you are serious about winning and taking it to its final conclusion.
Thank you. Rob, do you want me to defer to you? Do you want to take us out?
You're the moderator.
Well, but I take your presence up here as we got to shut it down.
If I ended the way you want.
Well, I mean, the best way to end it is just to give some love and thanks to everyone who's assembled up here and for sharing everything they've shared. And thank all of y'all, the survivors of this who remained. Thank you, and get home safely.
Thank you and good night. And please remember to look at leftforum.org for an evaluation. Please take the time to fill it out. It is important to us that this forum represents what you want to say. If you guys can just... Yeah, exactly. But I want to get...